program is brought to you by P. Murphy and Associates, successfully providing IT professionals to Southern California businesses.
Hi, this is Marlene Gibb with What Do You Do? And today's guest is Alex Blackburn. And Alex, what do you do?
Well, I am a local attorney and a city councilman.
Okay. And let's talk about you being a local attorney. Tell me about how and why you chose to become an attorney.
The why is probably a two-part question, part pragmatic, part idealistic. On the one hand, I wanted to be sort of a resource to my family and friends. There really weren't any other attorneys in the family. And I wanted to be a resource. I wanted to empower myself so I could empower my family in that regard. And the pragmatic answer is I wanted to make some money, and I didn't want to spend 8 years in grad school getting a PhD, and medicine didn't interest me, so I chose between law and an MBA. And I thought that law would be more empowering in the long term, so I chose that.
When you went to law school, did you know what kind of lawyer you were going to be? Did you know where you wanted to put the niche on law?
I had an idea. My interest had always been in, I'm entrepreneurial at heart. I've been, ever since I was a child, I've tried to find different ways, different avenues to start businesses and whatnot.
And what kind of businesses did you start when you were a child?
Well, I think the first thing I did is I went to the beach and I collected sand dollars, and then I went around to the neighborhood and hawked them.
Okay.
And I sold them, amazingly.
How old were you?
Late single digits, maybe 10. So that was kind of fun. So I knew I wanted to do that, and I was interested also in real estate. I wanted to essentially develop skills through my legal education that I could use outside of the practice of law down the road if I chose to stop practicing law or to get into some other avenue of work. I wanted to have acquired skills through my legal education that would allow me to do that.
So what do you want to do after you retire with real estate?
With law?
Well, are you going to go into real estate, or are you going to do real estate law?
Right. Well, I had an interest in real estate development when I was in law school, and potentially getting into that down the road. Frankly, though, I've wanted to be a writer since I was a child. So if I retire from the legal profession, that will probably be the first thing I do is to get into writing.
Are you going to write your psychological thrillers?
Yeah, most of the things that I write, that I've started to write or have written, have involved elements of kind of crime and intrigue and a lot of psychological elements.
Such as?
Well, my father is a prosecutor, and he had an interesting case involving a gentleman who attempted to decapitate his wife. And his defense was that he had post-traumatic stress disorder from Vietnam. So I wrote a work of fiction based on this story. Interesting twist here is that this gentleman had, at first blush, his story appeared to be airtight. He had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder 30 years earlier and had been receiving treatment ever since. Several different doctors, VA doctors, had signed off on this diagnosis. Well, it turns out he'd been faking it the entire time.
And nobody in 30 years picked this up?
Exactly. One doctor would just essentially sign off on the diagnosis of the prior doctor without really doing a more thorough examination. And frankly, he was a psychopath. He was a great liar, great manipulator.
How did they find out?
Well, my dad had the district attorney's investigator go and talk to family and friends and people that he had been in Vietnam with, and had discovered that a lot of the claims he was making were false. For instance, he, as part of his sales pitch to the VA doctors, he said that he was afraid of blood, the sight of blood really disturbed him. Loud sounds scared him and shocked him and sent him into some sort of relapse. It turns out that that was all completely false. He's an avid hunter, loves guns. In fact, he would go pig hunting, bring the pig back, dress it in front of people, play with the body parts of the pig, put the pig's eyeball in his mouth and pop it. And, he was a disturbed person.
Yeah.
So through interviews that revealed this information, it was discovered that he had essentially been maintaining a ruse for 30 years. So my dad was able to get a conviction against him.
So you like the psychological part of the story.
I do. So I used the core of the story there, the deception, the 30-year deception, as the basis for the story that I started writing.
Did you finish it?
No, it started to become apparent to me that a number of the characters could be identified with their real-life characters, namely my father. And I wasn't comfortable with that because it was a work of fiction, so I didn't want people to think that I was attributing certain things to him that weren't actually attributable to him in real life. So I chose to put that aside and work on something else in the future.
But you can go back and there are changes you can do.
Sure, absolutely.
That sounds like a good story, though.
Most of the pleasure reading I do now tends to be books that make good research for a future book. I have sort of a rough outline, some ideas for books that I'd like to write in the future. So I tend to the extent that I have time to read for pleasure now, they tend to be research-oriented. Yeah.
Who are your favorite authors in in the psychological genre?
I don't really have favorite authors. I did read a book recently that was fascinating called The Wisdom of Psychopaths.
The Wisdom of Psychopaths?
Yeah, it was very fascinating. It took traditional conceptions about psychopaths, which is also synonymous with sociopath, and looked at some of the basic assumptions and some of the basic wisdom regarding that population and questioned them. And he took a more objective approach. I think a lot of people write off psychopaths as being bad per se. And his approach was, well, let's look at their characteristics they bring to the table and see under which circumstances those could be beneficial. So it was a more objective, I think, enlightened approach. And it turns out that psychopathy is actually quite beneficial under a lot of circumstances. Spies, attorneys, CEOs. These are all people who rank highly on the psychopathy scale in general. Yeah, absolutely. I would like to think that I don't, but for instance, if you're sending a special forces soldier in to another country to do some dirty work, you don't necessarily want him to be hampered by an overabundance of empathy.
Right.
He needs to be able to go in and coldly do what he does and leave.
It's like hitmen.
Yes, and it turns out that really not all psychopaths are always psychopaths. Some people are able to turn it on and turn it off, and those are the psychopaths that he termed successful psychopaths. Essentially, the ones that don't end up in prison, that don't end up allowing their psychopathy to cause them to do antisocial things such as murder, rape, that sort of deal. They can use it in contextually appropriate ways and then behave appropriately in other circumstances that don't require it. So it was fascinating.
Yeah, it sounds that way. Well, now that you're talking about attorneys and CEOs,
sure.
Let's talk about you. You have three fields:
Sure.
business for small businesses or businesses. What would you say? You like to consult with people who are starting businesses or taking their businesses to the next stage?
Well, that practice really runs the gamut from business startup to the life of the business to the divesting of the business. So a lot of my clients are people who are starting businesses who don't necessarily know the best legal structure for their business.
Right.
whether it be sole proprietorship, a partnership, an LLC, a corporation. A lot of people don't know the difference between different types of corporations. And then for some businesses, there's a funding element to it. People want funding, they want to find investors, but they don't necessarily know how to legally structure those deals. So I'll assist them with that. I will counsel them as to the different strengths and weaknesses of the different types of financing, debt financing versus equity financing.
Okay, now I want to back up.
Sure.
When would you say that a person needs, I'm here, I'm starting this small business, it's only me.
Mm-hmm.
There's nobody else right now.
Mm-hmm.
And if I may use an assistant, but maybe I'll use her on a contract basis because I'm not sure. What would you tell somebody my size? Let's just start with the very beginning. It's a little bitty person. What would you tell them? Do they need a lawyer?
I would say yes. Without knowing more about the particular type of business, I would say that in general, anybody starting a business should at least go in for a consultation, a one-time consultation with an attorney, to at least determine whether or not there are concerns that need to be mitigated through the formation of an LLC or a corporation. Perhaps the sole proprietorship is fine. Perhaps you won't be exposed to a lot of potential liability down the road, and you don't need to spend the time and money setting up a limited liability entity.
Right.
But you won't know that most likely unless you talk to an attorney. Also, most businesses involve monetary transactions, most of which should also involve contracts. I think a lot of people don't use contracts to the extent they should, and then end up not getting paid and having limited means to collect. A lot of people who do use contracts don't include an attorney's fee provision in the contract.
Now, what's an attorney's fee provision?
An attorney's fee provision is a provision that says if there's a lawsuit based on this contract, the prevailing party has their attorney's fees and costs paid for by the losing side. The default law in California is that each party bears their own costs. So if you have a dispute over $10,000 and you do not have an attorney's fee provision in your contract, then it's most likely not worth it for you to file a lawsuit against the other person, because you will definitely pay more than $10,000 in attorney's fees to litigate that. Well, I can't say definitely, but almost certainly. I've never handled a piece of litigation through trial for less than $20,000.
So you're really looking at $20,000 by the time I pay you, plus trying to collect the $10,000.
Exactly. So it's important that you know these things right off the bat. If a person comes in for an initial consultation, I can say, well, what types of transactions are you going to be doing? This is the type of contract that you would need. I recommend including an attorney's fee provision, maybe some other alternative dispute resolution provisions.
Now, what's an attorney's fee resolution provision?
Alternative dispute resolution.
Okay.
That might require that each side engage in mediation prior to the filing of a lawsuit. So, okay, there's a dispute. Before we go to court, we're going to hire a mediator. Maybe a third party, an objective third party, can work this out over the course of a couple hours, rather than the parties having to go through the ordeal of filing a lawsuit.
Now, do most small businesses or businesses would prefer to work with a mediator? I mean, if it's going to cost me $20,000 to
Sure.
go to court, right?
Right.
And maybe with you and a mediator,
Mm-hmm.
it maybe cost $2,000 or $3,000.
Correct.
That would be worth it.
I think so. I think so. Although I make more money if we litigate, I would be thrilled if my clients and the other party were both willing to mediate disputes prior to going to trial. Usually that's not the case, though. Usually it's one side is willing to mediate and the other side isn't. If it's my client who isn't, I can often explain to them why they should, and they'll usually, if not always, follow my advice. Oftentimes, though, the other side, the other party has just disappeared or is non-responsive and is trying to stiff my client with the bill that we then have to go after.
Then you go into the...
Right. Then we file the suit, and That can take different routes. The person could not respond, in which case we get a default judgment, which is fairly inexpensive to obtain.
And then what's a default judgment?
A default judgment is when the other side doesn't respond to the lawsuit.
They ignore you.
They ignore us.
Okay.
We go in and tell the judge, hey, the required amount of time has lapsed for us to wait for him to respond. He hasn't responded. Please give us the judgment in the amount that we're asking for. And you will almost always obtain that.
Yes, like in small claims court, too.
Right.
Okay.
And then you have the challenge of collecting. So there are various ways to do this. I have frequently hired a private investigator to research bank accounts for the debtor and gone in and levied the person's bank account.
Now, but does that take a lot of paperwork and a lot of going to see the judge before you levy somebody's bank account, or is it
No.
just in California?
You get the judgment, and then you apply for what's called a writ of execution, which is a document that takes maybe a month to get processed through the courts. And then you take that and you provide it to the sheriff, who opens kind of an escrow account, and you have your process server serve the bank with the levy, and the bank processes the levy, sends the money to the sheriff holds on to it for a period of time, a statutorily prescribed period of time, which gives the person whose bank account was levied the opportunity to dispute the levy. I've never had anybody effectively dispute a levy that I've done.
No, they don't want to go back. It's going to be more money and time.
Right.
And
And then eventually the sheriff sends a check for the amount levied to me.
So let's back up. So if I'm coming to you and I'm
Sure.
a small business, I would have to have like those two things you talked
Mhm.
about, right?
Mhm. Well,
What else? Well, I mean, I
you-
would like to know that if I'm going to take somebody to court, that at
Correct.
least the legal fees are going to be covered.
Right. You're going to want to go, you're going to want to talk to an attorney, you're going to want to make sure that you're using the proper contracts, that you're operating under the proper form of business, whether it be sole proprietor, LLC, whatnot. You're also going to want to make sure that, to the extent possible, you're collecting information up front in the transaction that will later allow you to collect against this person if there's a dispute. So collecting a social security number would be very helpful.
Their bank account number.
Right, where do they bank, a canceled check, something along those lines. And if you're going to be hiring an employee, it's important that you're familiar with labor and employment law. There can be some pretty strict liability there if you run afoul of wage and hour laws, workplace discrimination, not allowing people to take breaks when they're supposed to, that sort of thing.
Do you go through all of this with the person in the beginning?
I do, yes.
And that's a couple. You're probably talking 2 to 4 hours going through all these things. Because if they're going to hire employees, that is very important.
Sure.
You know. Now, do you bring an HR person in?
Well, with my clients, the initial consultation is I charge a nominal fee of $100. It's sort of good faith money, if you will. But then there's no limit on the time that I give to the initial consultation. I'll sit there, and if they only need 15 minutes, 15 minutes. If they need 2 hours, I'll talk to them for 2 hours. And that's really the foundation for our relationship going forward.
Well, I think maybe into a two-hour session, you're both kind of know if you like each other and if this is going to
Exactly.
is work. I mean, sometimes you don't like them or they don't like you.
Unfortunately, it is the case that I've learned over time that some people make good clients and others don't. And there are definitely clients that I just choose not to take because
You
I
have
don't
red
think-
flags.
I have red flags, yes.
You have
Yes.
all these little red flags. The gut goes off.
Exactly.
And you've
Exactly.
learned probably the hard way.
Unfortunately,
when
yes.
the gut is going off and you're very intellectual about it, it's usually the gut that's right.
You don't have to get stiffed for too many bills before you start vetting your clients a little bit more strictly. Yeah.
So what type of clients do you like to work with in small business? Does it matter?
Well, it's always easier to deal with somebody who is a little bit more analytical, and a little bit less emotional about their business. Sometimes clients who are a little bit more emotional will be a little bit more impatient. They'll get ahead of themselves. They won't cross their T's and dot their I's before they expose themselves to potential liability. So it's easier to work with analytical clients. On the other hand, I feel like I bring more to the table. I have more to offer the emotional clients. What I bring to the table is a calming element, an analytical element that they're not bringing. So I feel like I'm able to help them perhaps more than the analytical client who's already sophisticated, who's already been in business and kind of knows what they're doing.
What are your favorite ones? I mean, what kind of clients have you had?
Well, my favorite clients are ones who pay on a timely basis.
Right.
And trust me. They understand that they're not the attorney. They understand that they don't know what they need to know from a legal standpoint, otherwise they wouldn't be talking to me. So clients who try to micromanage what I do and who question every decision I make are usually short-lived clients. I'm just not, that's not what I do. I expect my clients to trust me unless I give them a reason not to, which I never do.
Okay.
So, yeah, the best clients are those who vet me ahead of time and then trust me to do my job.
It's like having an accountant. You have to trust the accountant too,
Right.
because you don't know the accounting business.
Exactly.
But they'll tell you this is good, this is not a good decision.
The key is to vet your professional ahead of time. You know, look at reviews online, talk to other people, you know, get referrals from others. And once you've met with them and you've decided this is an honest person, this is a competent person, you have to trust them to do their job.
Where do you find the small business person, like as the little micro business? What are their biggest, where do they get into things over their heads?
I think a lot of times small businesses or small business owners don't want to spend the money up front to make sure that they have solid contracts in place that define the relationship between them and their customers. They try to save money in the wrong places. So that's not the place to save money because usually it costs you a lot more money in the long run. So it's fairly straightforward, but that's the area where most small businesses run afoul early. And if I can catch them early enough, I can usually prevent them from getting too far into business and exposing themselves too much with these non-existent or
And small businesses don't know sometimes. I mean,
right.
I mean, when I was in business with my husband, we learned everything the hard way.
Yeah.
And most of us do, right?
Yeah.
And then we'd add that little paragraph to the contract.
Right. Every 6 months you add another paragraph, you know.
Exactly, because we thought it would be tight on certain things, and you know, it can get really fluid.
Right. Right.
And we learned a lot of that in like what are the ones that are you do the job in a certain amount. The job is the job, and this is the pay.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those things can go on forever because there could be changes, and you only have one change in that contract.
Right.
Things like that.
Right.
I think those things are really important.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, because otherwise you're doing it, and it never gets done because there are too many changes.
Right.
And
Some contracts are going to require that change orders be in writing, or that any alteration to the terms of the contract be in writing. And a lot of times, small business people, they do handshake deals. You know, there's a basic contract. You have a decent relationship with the other person. A situation comes up. It seems as though that situation needs to be addressed immediately, and it seems as though there's not time enough to go back and modify the contract or memorialize your verbal agreement through an email. And then later down the road, the relationship kind of falls apart, and one person doesn't want to pay the other one,
and it leads to hard feelings.
Well, and a lightened pocketbook.
Yeah. So I think for me, I always think the contracts are very important because it's clear.
Absolutely.
It's very clear. Now let's talk about litigation.
Sure.
You like litigation, so let's.
I do.
Yeah. So when does it get to be a litigation issue?
Well, hopefully my clients never have to litigate anything.
Okay.
Because litigation is very expensive,
Right.
very time-consuming, even for the client. The discovery process, where the other side gets to seek information from my clients and gets to depose my clients, can be time-consuming and emotionally taxing, because most clients are not used to litigation, so they don't know what to expect, and that causes some anxiety. So if I can avoid litigation, I try to. But
it takes, in a way, it takes away from their work. It really does. I mean, they can't think because they're worrying about the litigation.
Right. So, I definitely take my client's psychological state into mind when it comes to settlement. Whether or not to accept a settlement offer or not, I take into account, how much stress this is causing my client, and whether or not my client has the stomach to continue litigating. Now, there definitely have been cases where I thought we had a strong, airtight case, and I encouraged my clients to keep going despite some uncertainty and some anxiety on their part, because the anxiety was mostly related to uncertainty about the outcome. So I could ameliorate that to some degree by assuring them, look, we have a very strong case, don't worry about it.
Yeah, but they're worrying about
I know.
it. They're looking at you and thinking, is this guy really, we know you're on the up, but is this really, can we just kind of settle it before we take it?
I had an interesting case recently in which a client comes to me, referred by an associate of mine. This person had guaranteed a merchant services account for a third party. Well, that merchant defaulted on about a little bit over $80,000 worth of charges. So now the merchant services company was coming after my client for over $80,000. And the initial concern by my client was, well, can they just go into my bank account and take the money out? So no, they can't. They have to file a lawsuit, they have to get a judgment, then they have to get permission from the court to levy your account. So that's not something that's going to happen overnight, and if we do go down that road, you're going to have plenty of notice ahead of time. It's just you're not going to wake up one day and find out that you have...
Well, yeah.
But most people don't know that.
Well, they think you got it. There's the judgment, and a week later, you're wiped out.
Well, they weren't even sure whether or not a judgment was required. They thought, that based on the language of the guarantee, that this merchant services company could just go in and take out the money.
Now, what is a merchant? Is
credit card processor.
Oh, okay.
So it's interesting. We'd initially offered to settle with them for a certain amount, and they didn't even respond to the offer. They were indignant. So we continued litigating the matter, and in the end, we settled favorably, and they ended up paying my client. They got nothing, and they ended up paying her. And this was one of my favorite cases because it was a case involving a very large, nationally known company with a team of very high-priced attorneys from a very prestigious firm. And
so you felt like David?
Well, they I hear from people all the time, I don't want to get into a conflict with this party because they have a lot of money and they can hire all the attorneys. They have better attorneys than I have. And that's really a bit of a fallacy. The law is what the law is. It doesn't change because the other person has more money than you. You don't necessarily need to hire a team of attorneys. They had 4 attorneys working on this case, 2 partners, 2 associates, and I trounced them.
Did you feel good?
Absolutely. And I felt great for my client, because I know that my client had some doubts along the way. So I felt mostly great about being able to do this for my client. There was some personal joy involved as well.
Oh, of course. Yeah, you won.
The nice thing about litigating against a very arrogant adversary is when you win, it's a lot more satisfying. You almost feel bad if the other person's, very humble and kind, But rarely do you find an opponent who's humble and kind.
Well, I think people feel when they're first starting off, well, they're better off with a small business lawyer because that person will give you better service, and the clock isn't ticking every.
Sure.
I don't think every 2 minutes or every minute, and with the big companies, that clock is ticking every minute.
Right.
And it's expensive. I mean, 4 people. I mean, that's a lot for one case. And You worked on it.
Just myself.
Just you against
Yeah.
4 lawyers. So, I
Right.
mean, you didn't have as many hours as all those lawyers combined.
You know, you'd be surprised. These days with judges, the court system in general, experiencing severe budget cuts, judges are overloaded with cases. They don't have time to read through, a 1-inch brief for every issue that comes before them. So a lot of times what will happen is these very high-priced attorneys from big firms, their sense of self-importance is a little bit overinflated.
So they're pages and pages.
Exactly. They
Okay.
think that people care about every little word that comes out of their self-important mouth, and it's not the case. They give the judge a huge stack of documents. They're risking the judge not even reading those papers at all before deciding on the motion, which I've seen happen.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. So, and then they hide the salient facts, throughout the brief rather than highlighting them and rather than being concise about it. So my approach is to make it as easy as possible for the judge to decide in my favor. I am very concise with my writing. I write as little as possible while covering the important points. I actually go so far as to submit my papers in 14-point font rather than 12,
They're all
just to make it easy to read.
they're all older too.
They are older.
That's the truth.
I
They don't
learned-
want to,
I learned that trick from a very, very successful attorney that I worked for in downtown Los Angeles, Wayne Grajewski. So,
It's very good. It's very good.
absolutely, and
Yeah.
and I've gotten some very good results from my motion papers. So although they do spend a lot more time, oftentimes those larger firms will, it doesn't necessarily translate into better results.
And most judges want a settlement. They don't want to be in court because the courts are clogged up right now. So they want these
Right.
cases to go through more quickly than they used to.
Right. Absolutely. And I think most judges realize that oftentimes it is the attorneys getting in the way of a settlement rather than the conflict itself being irreconcilable. Unfortunately, most attorneys allow their egos and themselves to get in the way of recommending or suggesting a settlement discussion or participating in it. Really, your job as an attorney is to represent the best interests of your client. Your own desire to beat the other side, your own dislike for the other attorney, perhaps they're very challenging, perhaps they're very insulting, all of which I've encountered. That should play no part in your negotiation with them.
How do you keep, as a lawyer, how do you keep your ego out of it, and then the other side really putting you down throughout the? I mean, how do you really keep that detachment? Because you can't get sucked into this.
Well, you have to be an emotionally mature person to have the ability to set aside your ego when being attacked, and you have to first.
But it's hard.
It is.
It is. I mean, someone's after and
It can't play a part. First you have to recognize your duty as an attorney is to maximize the benefit to your client. I, as the attorney, don't matter in the equation. I'm just there to offer the legal knowledge and strategic thinking, but my own interests don't matter. So I don't think most attorneys, or I don't think a lot of attorneys, start off realizing that. I don't think they approach litigation or representation, particularly litigation, with that mentality.
Don't they teach you this concept in law school?
Sure, but people are egotistical. People are insecure. They're not robots, right? They're emotional creatures, and most allow their emotions to get in the way of proper, zealous representation of the client. And I pride myself on not allowing that to happen. So.
And you started your business, you said 2009? But when did you graduate law school?
I graduated law school in June of 2006. I moved out to the D.C., Northern Virginia area for 6 months. I didn't do anything particularly profound when I was out there. I had met a friend in law school who was very outdoorsy, and he was from that area, and he regaled me with stories throughout law school of his times in the mountains around Northern Virginia. So
you spent more time in the mountains?
Oh, I went out to Northern Virginia, and I did nothing law-related whatsoever.
Okay.
I did a lot of fishing, a lot of hiking and canoeing, and I did it because I realized my opportunity to do that kind of thing was very limited. Once I settled in Los Angeles and put down roots, I wasn't going to be able to pick up for 6 months and go traipse around the mountains in Northern Virginia.
Did you think of staying in Washington or Virginia to go into law?
Not particularly. It is a very strong legal market, and you can make a lot of money there, but I've always wanted to come back to Los Angeles.
Well, you're a California boy.
I am, and Los Angeles has always been where my heart was, so I always knew I would come back here. Chicago almost got me. I lived there for a summer. It was amazing, but when it came down to it, I came
It's
back.
cold.
It can be, yeah.
It's very cold.
Yeah.
So you didn't want to. You didn't. Would have had to get your license.
Right.
Where did you get your license from?
Well, I got my license in California.
So if you went to Virginia, you'd have to get your license in
Sure.
Virginia.
That really wasn't the limiting factor. It was more just I wanted to live and work in California.
So you came back to California and you went with a bigger law firm, right?
I worked in downtown for a firm down there, doing mostly real estate, commercial real estate-based litigation. So we represented large developers. The firm represented, I believe, I was told at the time, the top 5 real estate investment trusts in the country. A lot of big developers. So I did that, and it was very educational. The first lawsuit I worked on involved a $30 million land deal, which was a little bit more than I had ever been entrusted with in the past.
That's a lot of money.
And it was fantastic. That trial, that matter ended favorably for our client.
How long did you work on that case? Did it go to trial?
Well, I was a junior associate on that
Oh.
case, so I didn't by any means lead it, but it didn't. It went to the eve of trial, and then a settlement. I think a favorable settlement was reached.
Those are common, aren't they?
Yes,
On the eve of the trial.
which is unfortunate. If you're going to settle, why not do it sooner?
Right.
But, so that I worked there, and then in 2008, when the liquidity crisis hit the market, that firm ended up merging with another large national firm downtown, and I went out on my own and chose to open my own practice rather than going to work for somebody else.
And you came to Monrovia.
I did. At the time, I was living in Glendale with family, but I had become aware of Monrovia because I have family living here who's lived here for some time. So I quickly decided to open my practice here and relocated to Monrovia. Yeah.
And so now it's almost 2013.
Yes.
So you've been doing this 4 years.
Yep. About 4 years.
As a starting off attorney, was it hard in the beginning?
It
Because
is.
you really didn't know anybody. You were new to Monrovia.
Right.
And you didn't want to stay in Glendale.
Right. And frankly, I was working with very limited funds in the beginning. So my first order of business really was meeting people and building credibility. As an attorney, you're dealing with high stakes usually, so that requires a foundation of trust between you and your client. So that was the initial challenge. So I spent a lot of time networking and building relationships.
But there aren't that many lawyers in Monrovia, are there? I don't think that, I'm not like Pasadena.
Right, it's a fairly open market. There are a number of attorneys here, but it wasn't saturated as I saw it. When I first started, there were more attorneys in town. Some of them have passed on or moved to other cities. And it would have been easy initially to try to compete on price, but I didn't want to do that. So I marketed myself by highlighting the strengths that I brought to the table that perhaps others didn't. So I was a new attorney at the time. At the time, I didn't have as much experience, so I marketed my aggressiveness and frankly, honesty. So those were the two things that I really pushed.
I don't picture you that aggressive. That's why I'm asking. Are you, except when you're in court, right?
Well, there's a time and place for everything.
Right. Right.
So, I'm a very competitive person. I've played a lot of individual sports throughout my life because I like that one-on-one competition. But like I say, there's a time and place for everything.
Well, but when I think of an aggressive attorney, I just think of them. They're in my face.
Right. Those types are incredibly annoying.
Yes. Well, they're in. Well, I know some. Yeah. Well, there's some good attorneys. They're in your face, but I mean, it's not comfortable to have somebody.
You don't need to be like that all the time.
Right.
You need to be like that
in
at
court.
the appropriate time.
In court.
Right. Or during discussions, there are times when, as a litigator, oftentimes you're a lot more successful with honey. You're a lot more successful being kind. Generally speaking, you end up with a better relationship with opposing counsel. They're less likely to be obstinate and refuse to accommodate you when you ask for them to accommodate you throughout the course of litigation. You want the other person to like you. If they like you, they're not going to try to hammer you as hard. In court, you want the judge to believe that you're the reasonable one.
Yeah.
I oftentimes let the other person run off at the mouth and spouting all kinds of nonsense.
Well, those are criminal lawyers, aren't they?
I say, okay, I let them talk.
Yeah.
And then I come across as more reasoned, rational, and thoughtful. You say fewer things, but make those things more meaningful. And I've gotten a good response from judges using that tactic. So.
And I want to go on with the litigation. And when people continue to grow their business, okay, and their business becomes, like, let's say, a $10 million business,
yes.
You work through the whole process of,
yes,
moving it from very small stages to the medium stages to larger stages,
yes.
And then what happens when people they have partners or family, and someone retires,
okay.
or someone dies? Well,
a lot of that can be addressed up front when the business starts, which is another reason why it's important to see an attorney in the beginning. I always recommend that my clients enter into if they're going to have partners or fellow shareholders, you enter into a buy-sell agreement. And a buy-sell agreement essentially defines, in the beginning, what happens upon somebody's death, or somebody's withdrawal from the corporation, the LLC, a divorce, so bankruptcy. So that's another reason why it's important to consult an attorney in the beginning, so that you can plan for what's going to happen at the end. If you don't, it can cost you a lot of money.
And do you have cases? Give me a case. Have you ever done any cases where it's been horrible at the end, where partners fight each other, or the
Yes.
families can be really, because if the child doesn't want to take over the business, or the children, there's usually one or two who are interested and the others aren't. This is what I've heard from talking to accountants, and yet they want the money pulled out of the business, and the other one doesn't have enough capital to keep the money, and that causes a lot of hard feelings.
Right. You need to address those things up front. If you're going to have an LLC, you want to make sure that most eventualities are contemplated by the operating agreements. The right of first refusal is a common right that is included within the operating agreements. If a member wants to sell their shares, they first have to give the company and then the other shareholders the opportunity to buy those shares before they sell them to somebody else, including the member's children or spouse or whoever. And you define ahead of time how those shares will be valued. What price will they be sold at? So you can determine that ahead of time. So a little bit of planning can save you a lot of money and heartache down the road.
When you're first starting off, I mean, it's hard for a person who's got nothing, right?
Right.
You're looking at maybe $10,000, $20,000, and to take that plan down 30 years, 25 years, how do you recommend that to somebody? because you're here. Is that a clear question? You're
It is.
here,
It is.
but you're not thinking 25 years down the road yet. You're
Right.
just right in the moment of
I
where
understand.
you are. And to project down that far, how do you handle that?
Well, that's my job.
I know,
So-
but
so
I
the-
mean, but I mean, if I came to you and I said, well, this is what I want to do, and then you're asking me these questions, I really wouldn't know what
Right.
I wanted in the beginning, or the family or the business starts growing, and to me, it's a process, but you still have to have a lot of that in place
Right.
within some kind of structure that you can be fluid and move around in.
There are a lot of terms that make sense in just about every operating agreement or set of bylaws. And then there are some that may not necessarily be universally appropriate, but there are a lot of protections that you can put in place that almost always make sense for a person starting a business to implement. So you don't really need to know what your business is going to look like down the road in order to know that these terms make sense.
And what would you tell people if they were just starting off? What would you say to them? Do you go over it with them if it's a good business idea?
I tend to. I tend to ask more questions. My goal is to make sure that they're not being impetuous, that their business idea is well thought out, and that it is sufficiently capitalized and if it's not well capitalized, that they have a plan for dealing with that, hopefully in the near future. Okay. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll ask questions, and if the client doesn't have the answers, it will become apparent during our conversation, and I'll usually suggest that they go and address some of those things before they get too far down the road.
And put too much money into it.
Exactly. I have a client right now who has been asked to become a founding member of a corporation, invest $175,000 in their portion. The other side's going to invest that, and then they're going to open restaurants overseas. Well, that's fine. It sounds kind of interesting on the face of it, but as I started asking more questions about, have you considered this option? Have you considered that option? Do you trust these people? How do you know that you're not going to wire the money into a bank account and it's just going to disappear? Do they have a do they have a background in the restaurant industry? Do you have a background? Well, if you don't, you're going to need the other person to. Do they? What's their history of success? And you'd be surprised. A lot of times these are the things that the other person just hasn't thought of. So, in this particular case, I recommended perhaps not doing a corporation together, perhaps doing a joint venture. They have their company, you have your company, you have a joint venture agreement that calls for injections of capital at certain times that make sense, and upon the happening of certain benchmarks. This way you keep control of your money. You're not just wiring $175,000 to somebody's bank account. That's really my job, risk mitigation.
Then you're more than a small business lawyer.
In some ways, but
Yeah.
I think a good small business attorney should do that. They should look for areas of risk, advise the clients about those areas, and then look for ways to minimize that risk. Yeah.
And this was one of your dreams, was to be a small business lawyer.
Well,
Besides a writer.
I would say that my dream initially was...
Actually, you have a lot of good material with the restaurants and the joint ventures. I mean, you've got a lot of good psychological material on this, too. Quite a good thriller.
I would say that my initial interest in life was to be an entrepreneur. This is a way that I can be involved in various types of businesses. I can see them, I can help them grow, I can be involved in creating them. But I'm not tied to any one particular business other than my own. And the business of law is a business. There's some fun in figuring out, okay, how can I do this better? How can I grow this? How can I make more money doing this while still providing the kind of service that I as a matter of principle, want to deliver. It's very easy to be a hands-off attorney and just hire a bunch of associates and not really be that involved and not really sure what quality of product they're turning out. That's not what I want to do. So,
that's interesting, because I find when I interview personally, I get to meet all kinds of people, all kinds of business people,
right.
but I'm doing the interviewing and asking questions,
right.
and I get a little. It's amazing what you learn talking to all these different kinds of businesses that you hadn't even thought about.
And I find that entrepreneurs are often very interesting, charismatic people. So I've had the great pleasure of meeting a lot of really interesting people with a lot of interesting backstories.
They've been burned many times, right?
Well, some of them.
Yep.
But it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Some people will come to me and they'll have almost no money, but they'll have their intelligence, their plan is well thought out, and they're charismatic, and they have drive. And even though they have almost no money, nothing but what's up here,
Right.
I have almost no doubt they're going to succeed. I can just tell when I meet some people, this person's going to succeed. They have the vision, they've put in the legwork to do the research, they have a plan, and they have drive, and they have the personality to attract investors. You know, it helps to be a good salesperson so that you can sell your vision.
And they have the flexibility to change on a dime within the
Right.
structure when they have to.
Right. Exactly. Some people get flustered when things don't happen exactly as they expect it. You're not going to be a successful business person if that's your mentality.
No, you can't, because
Right.
you can't. That means you can't change, and
Right.
you can't.
You can't
flow.
predict everything that you're going to come across in
No.
the future.
I mean, work here, and we all know every day is different. So
Yeah.
I'm going to end,
Okay.
and I want you to look at the camera and say your name and your telephone number and your email address.
Sure. My name's Alexander Blackburn. My telephone number is 626-301-4430. My email address is ablackburn@blackburnfirm.com. That's ablackburn@blackburnfirm.com.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. It was great.
Thank
It
you.
was great. I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
This is Marlene Gibb with What Do You Do?
This program is brought to you by P. Murphy and Associates, successfully providing IT professionals to Southern California businesses.